the chat bar. It's fantastic to see so many people here today, and some new and also familiar faces to the Masterclass programme. So welcome and good morning. I will hand over to our chair today, so that's Deborah Davis, Managing Director at the NHS North West Leadership Academy, to start our Masterclass this morning.
Morning everybody, welcome. It's great to see so many of you here, and as Vicky says, some familiar faces and some people that are new to me, so welcome, and I'm really looking forward to what promises to be a really interactive and interesting masterclass. I'm going to first hand to Alana, who I know we've heard it earlier for those who joined the call a little bit earlier, but Alana, if you just run through the technical aspects and so that everybody's aware of how we operate in this space. So Alana, I'll just hand over to you first of all.
No worries, thanks Deborah. Yeah, so we do have tech support on hand today, myself and Effie and other members of the team. So if you do have any issues, our numbers, we can drop them again in the chat box. They're there on the screen as well for you to take note. So please do share those with any colleagues that you know are struggling to join. If you hover your mouse, you should get a black bar at the bottom of your screen. You see the mute button and the stop video. If everybody could remain muted, just because we do have quite a lot of people on the session today, and then we can invite you to unmute yourselves as we go through questions. If you want to share your video, and I can see lots of people are, which is great, then the video button is at the bottom, but we are recording, so if you don't want to share your video, that's absolutely fine. If you want to see who's in the room, you can click on participants, and actually in there's a function to pop your hand up. So if you want to get the attention of any of our team, you can click on that. And then finally, you've got the chat function. So I've got mine popped out on a separate screen if you do have two, so I can see what's going on whilst I'm watching the presentation. Obviously not too distracting, I hope. But yeah, so if you have any issues, I would suggest signing out and trying to rejoin the session. And if you have any apps open in the background, maybe just close those down and it should help you with your bandwidth. But yeah, I'll drop my number again in the chat box. Give me a call if you're having any tech issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Alana. As I say, my name's Deborah Davis. I'm the Managing Director of the NHS North West Leadership Academy. And the North West Leadership Academy is one of the partners. We have a collaborative partnership across the North West with other development bodies. So the other partners are AQuA, that's the Advancing Quality Alliance, Mersey Internal Audit Agency, the North West Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, and North West Employers. So I'm sure you're all familiar with those agencies, and we've been collaborating for some years now, and obviously we particularly have collaborated around a series of masterclasses, which I think, you know, I don't know whether you've joined any before, but generally we've got some great feedback on them, and we've had some fantastic speakers, and hoping to bring you sort of best leading edge events and really a big thought leadership piece here. We're delighted to be holding this particular event on intentional inclusive leadership. I'm sure you know it is a very important, and I think really at the top of the agenda for everybody. I think particularly it's been brought into view since we've had the COVID crisis, and I think it's started to really highlight some of the inequalities. I think the sad part about that is that those inequalities existed previously, but actually perhaps weren't as high up the agenda as they needed to be. And I think the fact that the spotlight has been shone on this, I think can only be of advantage really. So we've got some great speakers here today, colleagues and friends. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Naheed, Tara and Sasina. They're going to take us through the masterclass, and really we want this to be an interactive, interesting and stimulating session really. So please, you know, do join in with the chats and the discussions, etc. Again, I think it's really important for all of us to consider, you know, how inclusive are we as leaders and as colleagues and as mentors, etc. So again, I hope that today we're going to get some really practical examples as well of how we can do that, because I think you know, it is something that we need to do actively, and I think it's great that this is called intentional inclusive leadership. The only thing, Alana mentioned that there is a recording of this, but just want to create a really safe space for discussions. So we will be removing the sort of Q&A sessions afterwards. We'll edit those out. So it's just to reassure you that, you know, we want this to be a sort of safe space for really, you know, challenging and perhaps emotive conversations, because, you know, sometimes this sort of agenda can make people feel uncomfortable, and I think it's how do we get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, because if we don't start to have the conversations we need to, then it's hard to progress the agenda. So as I say, it's just to say we will be editing any of those if there are any sort of sensitive issues that come up. Do feel free to get a tea and coffee at any point. We're not actually having a break, but obviously if you need a comfort break, we may just pop a comfort break in at one point when people are changing slides, etc. But please feel free to go and get yourselves a tea or a coffee at any point. I wanted just to introduce the programme, so we can go to the next slide, and you'll see what we've got planned this morning. Do we have the programme slide? Great. So you'll see that we've got Naheed is talking about what is inclusive leadership just in a moment. Then we have Tara, who's going to be talking about, in fact, let me just move that because I can't read the intentional conversations, as we said, reflecting on self. Then we'll be sharing an inclusive leadership tool. That's tool number one. Then we have Sasina, who's talking about understanding bias and micro inequities in the workplace. And again, how can we see these? How can we notice more actively about these things? And again, Sasina will be taking us through another inclusive leadership tool. So it's great that we've got some tools that we'll be able to take away with us. And then we've got a general Q&A session at the end there, really, just before we finish at 12. And then I just wanted to introduce some of the support team that are helping us this morning. So if we just go to the next slide, and if individuals would just introduce themselves. So Effie, if I come to you first.
Hello everyone, my name is Effie Wilson. I'm Project Support Officer at AQuA, and today I am your technical support. So if you have any queries or experience any technical difficulties during the session, please give me a ring. I've posted my number on the chat box and you've got it now on the screen as well.
And Alana, you've already spoken, but if you just want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alana Spencer. I'm the membership lead at North West Employers. So again, you've heard me speak, but if you do have any issues, as well as Effie, you can give me a call for any tech support.
Thanks, Alana. Vicky, it's you next.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Vicky from the NHS North West Leadership Academy. I'm the lead for communications and marketing. Welcome everybody today. So we'll be keeping an eye on the chat box because there will be opportunities for question and answers, and obviously Eve will mention Twitter as well. So welcome and good morning.
Right, Pam?
Hello everybody, I'm Pam Holstein. I am the comms and marketing lead at MIAA. I'm your chat box monitor today, so as other people have said, pop your questions, any remarks or observations you've got, pop them in the chat box. And I'm also looking after Twitter for MIAA, so hope to see you all tweeting at #CollaborativeNW.
Fantastic. Eve?
I'm the communications lead from AQuA, and as Pam said, I'll be over on Twitter today, so any thoughts, any questions, just use the #CollaborativeNW and we'll pick them up and share them throughout the session.
Thank you, and I'm sure we've just demonstrated the fact that this is a collaboration, as each of the partner organisations are involved in the whole event. So I'd really now like to hand over to Naheed Nazir, who's our first speaker. Naheed is the North West ED&I strategic lead in the North West People team, and he's also Associate Director for Inclusion and Engagement at the Northern Care Alliance. And Naheed's going to help us consider what inclusive leadership is. So I'll hand to you, Naheed, and have a great morning.
So like Deborah said, we're going to be talking about getting intentional about inclusive leadership. And today, we've got some excellent speakers with us in terms of Tara, who's my operational lead. and at NCA, and is a national campaigner and a leadership consultant who's going to be exploring privilege, and Sasina, who's the EDI professional with vast experience of working across systems and is currently the EDI workforce lead at CQC, who's going to be addressing bias and microaggressions. Okay, so inclusive leadership. Okay. I want to be listened to, not just heard. I want my presence to be felt and be real in the room and not just be visible. I don't need to be saved and for someone else to repeat my words, my points. Recent events globally and nationally have placed a spotlight on equality and inclusion and the sense of belonging, and rightly so. We have seen a volcanic eruption of injustices that have been bubbling beneath the surface for decades. And it's tragic that events like George Floyd's murder, Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic, LGBT Foundation seeing an increase of 38% of a number of LGBT people contacting their helpline, and many more, you know, it's taking events like these to actually for people to stop and take action and take notice. However, here we are. And if we don't act now, if we don't challenge now, if we're not bold and courageous now, nothing will change. We have to use this time, this space, to embed what some people have branded radical changes. For me personally, it's what we should have always had: fair, equal rights in everything. A lot of you will have already seen this particular slide and this particular picture. And so often I've had conversations with professionals who say, Naheed, we treat everyone the same, equally and fair. We don't see colour, we don't see disability, we don't see anything. We treat everyone the same. So that's okay. So everyone has the same preference as you then, because they say we want to treat everybody the way that we want to be treated. But everyone is not different and doesn't have differing needs. So a deaf person walks into your surgery, whether it's clinical or not, and you treat them the same as a non-deaf person before them. So this is where the problem lies. Because everyone is different, we measure it. We've got the gender pay gap, we've got the ethnicity pay gap, even the COVID data that we have, it's there, it's measuring everyone's difference every time. Why do we try to treat everyone like the way we want to be treated? Why do we add those extra layers? So, in terms of looking at this picture, we add more boxes to make it a fair and equal. Okay. What if we run out of boxes? What if we haven't got enough to provide for everyone? What if they break? Yeah. We need to set our ambitions higher. We need to get to the end box, to the liberation. We need to identify the barriers, the visible ones and the invisible ones, and we need to pull them down to remove them. We need to be a society that is changing and treating people how they want to be treated. Inclusive leadership. So we hear this being bandied across a lot. Everybody wants to ensure that we're being inclusive and we're being an inclusive leader. But what is it? What is inclusive leadership? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And what does it sound like? And what is the first word that comes into your mind, into your head, when you think about inclusive leadership? If you want to put that into the chat box, please do. But I just want to go back to those three main points that I mentioned earlier. I want to be listened to, not just heard. I want my presence to be felt real in the room and not just be visible. I don't need to be saved and for someone else to repeat my words, my points. The challenge with changing perspectives on inclusion is that so often privilege instills a sense that even in the face of inequalities, the problem is something we with privilege have the knowledge to solve. Rather than accepting that we need to move to one side to ensure our experience doesn't dominate a space and we have the right knowledge and skills to dismantle the systems that continue to lead the same inequities repeating themselves time and time again. An example of this is when leaders create spaces to tackle inequalities but center them around the people they feel are important, rather than having the balance of those that are able to make the decisions with the people who are facing inequalities feel are important to be included and heard. Being an ally is not about being the savior. It's about stepping to one side, allowing others to come forward and working together for change. I just want to leave you with this quote. Leadership is about empathy. It is about having the ability to relate to and connect with people for the purpose of inspiring and empowering their lives. And that's a quite powerful quote, and it'll mean different things to different people. But for me, it is about inspiring others. It is about empowering people. It is about uplifting people and giving people that opportunity and the space to enable them to do that. Okay, so that nicely actually leads me on to introduce Tara. So Tara is now going to talk us through and exploring privilege.
Hi everybody, thanks for that introduction, Naheed. And I'm hearing that the cogs and the brains of people that are on the call just reflecting on all of those powerful words. I know I've heard you say many things working with you, and you always make me sit back and reflect on what we are doing as leaders and how we're having an impact. And you did that again so far this morning. So moving us on to look at privilege, which Naheed's mentioned, one of those areas that inclusive leadership really means when we talk about what it means to be an inclusive leader, is about actually reflecting on our privilege, actually owning our privilege, and actually thinking about how we can act to have an impact on our privilege. But before we even go into that, I think most of us who are on this call will accept and will have heard people say, well, talking about privilege is difficult. People are uncomfortable with the conversations that we have about privilege. I want us to reflect on that for a second. The fact that actually even having a conversation about the topic of white privilege, on the topic of cisgender privilege, on the topic of heterosexual privilege, could go all the way through different privileges. That's a problem. If we can't even talk about the challenge, if we can't even discuss and look at the challenge that we need to work on, and this is one of the big challenges that we need to work on, if we're going to see a system that changes, then we're never going to get anywhere. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen actually really slow progress when it comes to achieving equality within the UK over the last few years. You'll hear lots of people say, oh yeah, we've made all this great progress, it's great to celebrate. If you go and speak to communities and you go and speak about the scale of inequalities that still exist in our organisations when we're facing hate crimes in the community, educational opportunities, housing opportunities, opportunities to be visible in the media, opportunities for people not to only put you in the media when they're going to say something negative about you, then actually communities will say that it isn't enough. We haven't seen the scale of change that we want to see. We don't want just to see one good news story. We want to see a society where we don't have to have these conversations anymore. And I think we're a long way away from that, particularly because we found this conversation so difficult to have. Now, I've often had this conversation, and for those people that know me, I'm not willing to let people say, this isn't a conversation you should have. I think it's important that actually when people say the conversations you shouldn't have, those are exactly the conversations that we should have. But actually, I think it's important that we frame privilege in a language that can connect with people, that actually people can understand, that people can relate to. And when I look at privilege, I think about it as an absence of experience. It's something that you can't necessarily understand because you haven't experienced it yourself. So when we're looking at privilege, it's very important for us to think about what are those absence of experiences in our lives. So Naheed was mentioning when you speak to some leaders and some people, and there might be people on the call today who have thought in that way, is that people tell me, well, I don't see colour, I don't see sexual orientation. Actually, I don't see why people face those challenges. I'm nice to people. I see my friends being nice to people, my colleagues. I don't see why we've got inequalities in our team. And actually, again, that comes from a really good place. Those people that you're having those conversations with, the fact that you're having that conversation is often those people are wanting to be a good leader. They're wanting to move forward and be more inclusive. But actually, a bit like driving a car, our cars have blind spots. It doesn't matter how long you stare in your mirror, you will not see that blind spot. So reflecting on myself, I'm a white, middle-class trans woman who has disabilities, I have hearing loss, I'm bisexual. But actually, I'm never going to be a trans person of colour. I'm never going to know what it's like to be a Muslim Asian woman. And actually, it doesn't matter how hard I think about that. It doesn't matter how hard I go and look. I'm never going to have those experiences just looking at myself and just looking at my own life take. Actually, I have to understand that. I have to accept that and not see that as a criticism, but just see that as a reality of where we are. So I think privilege is a conversation that we must have. It's a conversation that we must tackle. We must tackle the conversations that don't want us to talk about privilege. But when we frame the conversation, we should frame it about a discussion about the absence of experience, because that's a real way to connect to people. And the analogy that I used about those blind spots on a camera, I've used in coaching conversations with leaders when people have felt challenged or uncomfortable. And it's a really good tool to help people to reflect and think about where they are. So intersectionality. So when we're talking about privilege, it is really easy to get into a one-dimensional space. So we'll often talk about white privilege in a space, or in a different space, we'll talk about cisgender privilege. And actually, it's important to reflect with all of these conversations that humans are much more complex than one protected characteristic or one part of their identity. Again, speaking with my own lived experience as a senior trans person working in the NHS, I've experienced a whole range of barriers in my career. I get death threats from the media before I even come into work. I get people harassing me on forums. I have leaders making uncomfortable comments about me in spaces when I'm not there. But actually, I don't experience the racism that my trans colleagues who are trans people of colour experience. I don't experience some of the barriers that people that don't have the networks that I have, people who are trans and unemployed right now. And so when we're looking at reality, if we're looking at unpicking inequalities, we always need to ground that in intersectionality. And I think there's a real danger with some of the direction that, not through bad intentions, but through actually good intentions. If we look at the National People Plan, this drive to go through staff networks and actually to have our staff networks leading the agenda within the NHS. And I know in other public sectors, there's a drive to make sure that staff networks really have that voice. But we can't see individual staff networks in isolation. We can't look at LGBT issues without looking at race issues. We can't look at disability without looking at sexism in the workplace. And actually, it's important that we bring those together and we channel that through our leadership and the discussions that we're having. But actually, life is even more complex than that. So just when you think you've got it, and we've talked about protected characteristics, and we're thinking about those groups that we're discussing, actually our context, our environment, the situation that we're in. And really, I put this slide up as more of a marker to talk about the scale and the breadth of inclusion and equalities work. And I think that's another reason we haven't seen the scale of change, is because when you discuss equality at a leadership level with senior leaders, at very senior leaders, often there's this sort of perception that we can do something with an action plan in the centre. We can put an action plan together, we can tackle some of these issues, we can get going. We can have a group in the middle of an organisation that's maybe 10,000 staff, 15,000 staff, and we can sort it, we can move forward. And I'm here to say that inequalities are way bigger than that. Actually, if you just look at the scale of inequalities across workforce, services, health inequalities, across the range of services that your local authority, NHS, police and other organisations will deliver, then it's vast. But then if you also look at the individuals that are impacted by those inequalities and the reasons why they're impacted, just looking at this one picture on the screen, you can see how big it is. So actually the key to getting that change is to accept that it isn't a simple problem. It isn't something that you're going to solve with an action plan. You need to put the same amount of resources into this as you would any complex challenge within your organisation. And your ED&I function and the support that you put in that is around equality and diversity is about enabling that change at every part of your local authority, every part of your NHS trust. The action should sit in the departments and in the operational teams where services are delivered or where the workforce is supported. It shouldn't sit in the centre. It shouldn't just sit within an equalities team. They're there to provide that support, that expertise to enable that change to happen. So just remember that breadth, scale, complexity, and maybe why you need to direct a lot more resources towards this work than you originally thought that you needed to. So we talked about this idea that privilege is an absence of experience, and that actually what's important for that is that we reflect and understand ourselves if we're actually going to be able to tackle and dismantle that privilege. And actually, I know how incredibly busy the world is, and particularly for colleagues that have much bigger portfolios in much more senior positions than I am. And I struggle to find time to self-reflect. I struggle to find that time in my diary to actually just sit in the moment and just to think about where I am. How am I impacting on people around me? Actually, how am I acting? How am I considering intentionally the things that I don't know? Because actually I've got 5 reports to do, 2 MS Teams meetings to have on simultaneously, and then a telephone meeting to go into straight afterwards, which we all know is our world at the moment with us moving to this virtual world. There's maybe colleagues that actually were used to working virtually pre the pandemic that we probably need to tap in a little bit more to see how they've managed some of those time constraints and their calendar much better than people like me. But actually it is vital that we don't see that time to self-reflect as a luxury, as something that we do when we've got time. We see it as something that's essential to make sure the things that we're doing in that time are being done to the quality and to a way that is inclusive for our team, our service users, and actually for the benefit of our communities that we're here to serve. When it comes to that self-reflection, we need to be honest about our strengths and weaknesses. It's really great to say what we're good at. It's really great to say, I'm really inclusive, I've gone on a training course and I think I know things about this topic over here, and I've had some really good feedback from my LGBT staff who say that I get it. But actually, being honest, there's not a destination to this journey. There's not this idea that you suddenly become good at being an inclusive leader or good at equality. I mean, I'm an equalities expert. It's my job. It's what I spend my time doing. It's what I spend my own time doing as an activist, as a campaigner, as somebody who believes that it's important that we all have a role in making the world a better place. And I haven't finished that journey. I get things wrong. I've got areas that I need to develop and reflect on in terms of my own privilege and understanding other people. So actually, you need to be honest about where are those gaps that you don't know about situations and how you can develop. Now, let me give you a really good example. Some of you might have seen the controversy over what happened yesterday with some trans people actually struggling to get access to hormone medication as a result of a regulator intervening within a private provider in the UK. Now, let's not get into a discussion about where that goes and the rights and wrongs of that. That's for a different space. But when I was talking to cisgender senior leaders in our system about why trans people are upset with that, why trans people are feeling challenged and feeling attacked, a lot of the response, if you look on Twitter, was people going, I don't understand. This film's really complex. I don't get how has this happened? I don't feel able to comment or get involved in this situation. And that's because that's a gap in people's knowledge. That's a gap. They're not impacted by this situation. They haven't been historically, and people haven't had the time to go and actually learn about why those issues are impacting on a community. And that's just one example. I could have looked at any other community, but there's often knowledge that you need to intentionally go and seek out and learn so that you can be that active ally and start to dismantle that privilege that you might have. Feedback. Feedback is vitally important in enabling that change. Actually, understanding the impact that we have on leaders should be the way that we measure leadership behaviour. The amount of leadership behavioural frameworks that I see in organisations that are X's and ticks, this idea that behaviour is a good or a bad thing, this idea that human interactions are binary, that actually one thing's going to be good and one thing's going to be bad, and that's the way that we suddenly change behaviours and culture. We all say that culture is complex, but yet we think that's the solution to actually delivering change. I'm here to challenge you to say that actually, if we're understanding the way that we impact as leaders, we have to talk to the people that are around us and ask them about their views on how we've impacted on them as a BME colleague, as an LGBT colleague, as somebody having multiple protected characteristics and experiencing multiple barriers within their workplace. So actually, as a leader, it's the wake that you leave around you that is how you should be judged in terms of how inclusive you're being as a leader, not whether you've done a list of protocols, followed a list of policies, or followed a list of behaviours that someone's handed you on a sheet of paper. And if you think that's what being an inclusive leader is about, actually you need to go back to the drawing board and start speaking to some of the staff that you manage. Decision making. When it comes to making decisions, all of us are going to make bad decisions, wrong decisions, make mistakes. I know I've made so many mistakes, both in my professional life and in my life at home. And I'm so grateful for those people that have continued to challenge me when I'm going off in a tangent and actually not having the impact that I want to have. Because those people that have challenged me when I didn't want to hear that challenge are the people that have helped me learn. And actually me taking time to listen to those people that have helped me develop as a leader. And actually, I think that's a really good challenge for us in the moment to say, is there a voice there? Is there somebody that would be challenging me if they could before I go and make that decision? Actually really intentionally thinking through, what is it I'm about to do? And again, that's difficult. We're all time pressured. We've got actually a lot of decisions to make very quickly, depending on the circumstances in our job role. But actually we can all take 10 seconds, a minute, a day, depending on what the decision is, to reflect and unpick. Actually, do I need to go and touch base with somebody that's got a different perspective to me on this? So this is going to be a really exciting exercise where I want to have a discussion with a couple of colleagues who we've mentioned beforehand that they're going to be in this discussion, because I think it's really hard in this virtual world to make sure that you're not just talked at for a whole period of time, but actually in a way that it feels like there's some sort of narrative going on with some people being involved, and it can be hard to involve everybody. So in a second, I'm going to invite some colleagues to introduce themselves, and then we're just going to have a chat about some of the conversations that we have with leaders about equality, and actually how can we do better? How can we all take more time to think about the impacts of lived experiences? How can we take more time to think about the actions that we need to take? But I just want you to reflect on the comments that are on the screen at the top in the coloured boxes. White colleagues claiming we need more data to understand why BM equalities exist before acting. The amount of times I've been in meetings where people have said to me, we need to have some more data before we know what we can do. Not even that we need data to do something, but we need data now before we can know what it is that we need to do, because we might be different. Well, actually, when it comes to institutional racism in the public sector, I think we're all in the same boat, and I think that boat needs to be turned around and go into a different port. So actually, we don't need any more data. What we need is actions, and we need to actually look at where those actions have started to work, and we need to not be afraid to bring those actions into our organisations and accelerate them at pace. When it comes to colleagues claiming that actually, slides coming up. When it comes to colleagues saying that they don't claim to see someone's colour, sexual orientation, or whether someone's disabled, I've mentioned that already, but that's still something that continues to happen in discussions. You get people just saying, I don't see why there's a problem. I don't see somebody in that way. So if I'm a good leader, then everybody else must be a good leader. But they're not reflecting on that comment in itself, doesn't recognise the different barriers, the exclusion that people might be experiencing because they've got a different lived experience to you. Cisgender and heterosexual colleagues saying they don't see any issues or barriers for LGBT staff because their gay friends have said actually everything's fine for them, they don't face any barriers. again, as a bisexual trans person, the amount of conversations I've had with heterosexual cisgender leaders who've tried to tell me what the reality is like for LGBT staff because they feel it's okay. And again, not normally from a really bad place, normally in a really positive conversation, that person goes, actually, that's not the experience. People are telling me it's fine. And actually, me having to challenge back, going, who are those people in your bubble? They might be telling you it's fine because you're their friend, but when it comes to actually how many people we're opening up about, we know from surveys such as work that Stonewall's done in the bisexuality report recently, that nearly 50% of bisexual people in the UK do not feel comfortable or actively disguise their identity when it comes to the workforce. And I could go across a whole range of data and statistics to demonstrate that. But again, I shouldn't have to. I think it's actually, if we Google it and we go out there and we speak to people, it's obvious, it's staring us in the face that that's a reality. And then finally, I think this is particularly apparent. I call this catching the cricket ball. Actually, there's been a lot of challenge when it comes to equality recently as a result of Black Lives Matters and as a result of the pandemic. And I think a lot of leaders have felt quite threatened by that challenge, particularly organisations that haven't progressed and haven't had the impact that they might have wanted to have. And we've seen lots of nice statements going out from everybody. People that have never done anything on this have issued a nice statement. I'm not interested in a nice statement. I'm interested to see what you are doing. Don't issue a statement unless you're doing something. Because what I see when I see a statement and no actions is trying to find a way to stop that challenge having an impact. It's a customer services response. It's a response to say, leave us alone because we need some space to think about this, but we're going to say something nice and you're going to look bad as somebody with lived experience challenging us because we're saying that we're interested and we want to do something about this. So that's why I call it catching a cricket ball, because if anyone's caught a cricket ball before, if you don't step back to catch it, it hurts and it has an impact. So we need to stop catching the cricket ball and maybe start throwing the cricket ball at some of those barriers that we're seeing, dismantling them and listening to our staff that are telling them there's inequalities in our workplaces and our communities that are telling us that they can't access services. So that's an introduction to our discussion. And I just wanted to ask, I'm going to ask individual colleagues that are joining the fishbowl just to introduce themselves one by one. So if I can start by asking my colleague Hannah to come onto the call and just introduce herself.
Hi, thanks, Tara. So I'm Hannah Chandersingh, and I'm a transformation lead for race equality at University Hospitals of Morecambe Bay. And this is week 2, end of week 2, so it's a very new role. But it's really, really great to be invited onto this call. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Can I have Pav?
Hi, it's Pav here from Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Trust. I'm the Equality and Diversity Lead here.
Thanks, Pav. Can I ask Debbie?
Hello, I'm Debbie Herring. I assume I'm the Debbie you're talking about. I'm a People Officer at Liverpool University Hospitals. And I'm here today really to listen and to learn because I recognise that I lead the equality service for the Trust, but that there's an awful lot I don't know and wouldn't claim to understand. So I'm here really just to learn and absorb.
Thanks so much for the three of you joining me today in this discussion. I deliberately didn't want you to do any preparation for this discussion. So colleagues that are expecting speeches or montages and monologues from the colleagues joining us to speak, that's not what this is about. I want this to be the type of conversation that actually we should be having in our staff rooms if we were there in person, or on our MS Teams calls when we're discussing equality, because I think it's only through informal conversations that actually some of that real change happens. It doesn't happen with someone just talking at you at a PowerPoint presentation. So just wanted to start us off, because just to get us going, and just say to any of you who want to come in first, why should we take time to be aware of the lived experiences we don't hold? So not our own lived experiences, but actually understanding other people's lived experiences. Does anyone feel like you're able to come in?
I'll come in. So I think we've, like you say, we've all got blind spots, and we all come in with our own ideas of what is the right thing and what needs to happen. But I think it's only really by having these conversations with each other. And even when we've got these staff networks, you know, we've got a BAME network, we've got an LGBT network, and we're having these quite separate discussions. I think we can quite easily lose sight of the bigger picture, which is making everybody feel valued and everyone feel that they have a voice. Because doing something that will help one group might actually create unintended or unnecessary difficulty or barriers for others. And I think only really by having these discussions in this sort of a forum with other people who've got completely different experiences will enable us to create that environment that actually works for everyone.
Pav, is that something you've seen through your experiences as well?
I mean, I'd say that one of the big challenges for me in terms of people who don't necessarily have lived experience, and I come from, you know, an LGBT, a faith background, Muslim heritage, British Asian, you know, I've got a hidden disability. What's really interesting in terms of my experience, my engagement with people is often that when I work with systems, and certainly, you know, in the NHS, but I'm new to the NHS. I came from local government, well, Parliament, and I'm a local councillor. So what's really interesting for me is how we often fail to recognise and cultivate and harness some of those diverse experiences, but also the richness of those experiences and the expertise that already exists in communities. There's a perception, in my view, and I'm now speaking as an NHS person, is that the NHS knows best. And I often think, actually, you don't. And the communities that you serve often know better what their needs and aspirations are. And if we don't listen and engage, we completely bypass or miss what their needs are. It's as if you are speaking another language and you misinterpret. And I'll give a concrete example, if I may. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, my mum, who doesn't speak a great deal of English and has, you know, post-COVID is in a recovery sort of space now. The nurses came along and said, "Oh, do you feel safe at home?" And my mother interpreted that as, well, of course I feel safe. The robbers are outside, I'm at home. But that's not what the nurses were meaning. There were no interpreters involved. Luckily, I was in the room at the time, and I said, "No, Mama, they're asking, are you safe? Safe, as in the home." So there was that little moment, or that lack of, you know, intelligence, if you like, or the ability to communicate, meant that we were speaking on having parallel conversations, and my mum's healthcare needs would have been completely missed as a consequence.
Thanks, so Pav, for bringing those real experiences as well to this discussion, and not just making it academic, and actually talking about how that really impacts in your life. Debbie, could I ask, in your leadership team and actually the discussions that you have, can you think of times where your team's maybe taken time to look at what isn't in the room and actually those gaps that you've got? Or is it maybe something that more leadership teams need to do, that because actually with all of the pressures, it's really difficult to find time to do that? What's your thoughts? We've
just had a cultural assessment done for our BAME staff, which we started as a new trust because as part of our engagement around building our values and behaviours, when we merged, we wanted to really go out to everybody. And what we realised was that we weren't getting enough representation from those members of staff. So we did an additional piece of work using Clive Lewis. I don't know if you've come across Clive from Globus Mediation. And what's come out of there is really quite telling. And he's just done a workshop for us at our board. And I think it's that thing about trying to take the board on a journey, which is what I'm trying to do, really, to sort of, I suppose, undo what they think they know, and to actually listen to people on the shop floor giving their experiences. And it's back to, I think, what people said about thinking we know best, and that, you know, people often are coming from a place of wanting to make it better. They're not coming from a place of, you know, wanting to discriminate or get it wrong. But we wouldn't do that around a patient. Well, I hope we wouldn't these days just assume we know best. We would ask, wouldn't we? Or if I'm doing something else in HR, you know, in my portfolio, I wouldn't assume to have all the knowledge or the service knowledge. we'd go and ask the service, wouldn't we, and say, what's going on here? What do you need? What staff do you need? How does it work for you, etc.? Explain to me your service. And yet we don't do that here. We sort of assume we know best. And what was interesting was some of the feedback. We had feedback from people saying, you know, when we'd written out to everybody recently from the chief exec and myself, we had run it past one person actually from a BAME background, but the people on our now, we've got an exec-led group with quite, you know, a diverse range of people on it. They said, well, that letter you put out didn't land well at all on the shop floor, you know, with all of the staff, because they thought it was quite patronising. And, you know, you really do need to think about who's your audience and what you're putting out there, which we would for other things, wouldn't we? We'd already think, who's our audience, who are we trying to reach, and what do they want, you know, what do they need, what do they want, how do we get their views? But somehow we don't, we sort of just oversimplify it and think we're doing well. So that's some of my recent experience. And we were quite shocked by that report. We were shocked as well from a number of the consultants, because you always think that a number of the consultants have got their own, I suppose, by nature of their status, their own power base within the organisation. But we had comments from very senior consultants from a BAME background saying, actually, the nurses in this area walk past me if there's two of us on here, and go to the white consultants who is exactly the same as me, and you know, they don't even know they're doing it. Things like that. They're just a couple of the comments that people made. They made comments about patients, saying that actually members of staff, managers, moved them to protect them from a patient who might be racist or whatever, rather than dealing with the issue. And I can understand what we think that, you know, right, let's just manage the situation. We've got to look after the patient. It's a difficult situation. We don't want to put this person at risk. It's in the heat of the moment, often in A&E or somewhere like that. And therefore our managers think they're doing right, think they're protecting the person, looking after them, but what they're actually doing is encouraging that behaviour, allowing it to continue. So they're just some of the snippets of the sort of thing that came out of that review. There's lots that I think really took us aback and has quite shaken, I think, people in the organisation. And now it's about what do we do with that and how do we build a new culture.
Debbie, what I like about that in terms of how you framed those comments was the way you talked about how we wouldn't look at this in the same way if it was something else. And I think the example you also said around how managers are trying to respond to situations but don't have the skills to, you know, what they're doing. And I think that's what I was getting at earlier around the lack of resourcing and the lack of work that's gone into ED&I, and sometimes this absence of understanding about the professionalism and expertise that revolves around ED&I work. And when it comes to lived experience, actually having one person with a protected characteristic doesn't always give us the reality of a situation. Because I don't know what it's like to be me. I don't know what it's like to be another trans person. And the example I'll give, I don't know what it is about BBC Northern Ireland, but they seem to constantly want me to come on to talk about things that I have no experience to talk about. And it's always nice to get media requests. But the two times BBC Northern Ireland have contacted me, one was about trans people actually being excluded from athletics, and two was to talk about trans people being excluded from international rugby. And my response to both times was, I eat cake. I like cake. I know nothing about playing international rugby or being an athlete in athletics. There are plenty of trans athletes and plenty of trans people that play sport at a much higher level than I've ever played sport that you can go and talk to. Just because I'm Tara and I might be accessible because I've gone and talked about political affairs, law, other areas that I am an expert in that you might get me on your show to talk about, doesn't mean that you press your speed dial button to get me on to talk about athletics. But the same way at work, when it comes to ED&I practice, ED&I leads are often the people that are told, you go and do the work. You go and tell us what actions we're going to need to change surgery to make it more inclusive, or to change this area of mental health care to be more inclusive. Again, my response is, well, I did human rights and discrimination law at university. I'm not a surgeon, I'm not a nurse, and I'm not a clinician. But what I can do is give you some tools, some evidence, some information. I can coach you. I can give you a governance structure, a project structure to actually work through those challenges yourselves as leaders. But if we're going to see that change, you need to bring in both the expertise, a range of lived experience, listen to that, own that, and then implement that for change. So it was just really, and that's the same way we would look at safeguarding, the same way we look at infection control, the same way we look at any other area of complex specialism within healthcare, and we could say the same in local authorities. But when it comes to ED&I, sometimes we move away from that. Just to ask the three of you, one of the things that you often hear is this idea of owning your privilege. And actually, it's a concept that people talk about. I own my privilege. It's actually a tweet that often people tweet out there. And we often hear this concept of virtue signaling and saying, yes, I'm owning my privilege. But what do we mean? When we're aware of our privileges, how should that impact on our actions? What does that tangibly mean if we're going to be inclusive leaders? And maybe open it up to any of you just to maybe give a reflection on what that means to you. Who wants to come in? Don't be shy.
Tara, I'm going to touch on Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie because it's Black History Month, so why not reference a brilliant Black African Nigerian writer? She talks about the single story narrative and the dangers of that. She's done a brilliant TED talk actually. So just connecting the point that Debbie and you were just making around single stories and why we shouldn't just depend on the one person who represent an entirely diverse set of people in the community. On the issue of privilege, I think, I've got some of my team members on the line. I came into an all-women team, and it was a really, I'd never been in an all-women team before, so that was something I was acutely aware of. And I feel that I've made a concerted effort to try to acknowledge that reality, and that I come with a number of privileges. I know my experience as a brown Asian male is very different to the experience of some of my colleagues who may be African heritage women, and particularly younger women, and so to acknowledge those differences, to show to give value to those differences, and to then seek to include those perspectives and those viewpoints. I think it's really conscious. There's no point pretending that it doesn't exist, because it is there. And just acknowledge it, because that enables us to be on a level, and then say, well, what does that bring? How does that influence? How does that affect policy position or issue that we're discussing? And what's your take on it? And invite people in. Value people's perspectives, bring that perspective in, and don't just go to like-minded people. That's the absolute danger point in the NHS, in my view. In my short term that I've been here, I'd say I was in Parliament here and then private sector. Very big difference I've seen is that in private sector we had very agile workspaces. You brought in people from all over the place, and I've never seen such a hierarchical organizational structure as I have in the NHS. It's shocking. They won't talk to you if you're not at least a grade within range. It's hilarious, but that is privilege too, and we need to acknowledge that and start dismantling some of that, because you're losing really talented people and really talented viewpoints as a consequence.
Thanks, Pav. Hannah, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, so sort of leading on from that, Pav, I really hear what you're saying, and I think I certainly find that as a multiracial person, I certainly have a lot of privileges that a lot of people in my networks don't have. And I am aware that I certainly have the floor a lot more than others might do. And I think a really, really key part of owning your privilege and using your privilege is ceding the floor. And giving other people a voice. So being being the man in the meeting who sees a woman being interrupted and brings her back in, because it's difficult to get that back. I think you mentioned particularly younger Black women finding it, having a very difficult experience in certain ways, and I think we all have different privileges, but if we can recognize that and use that privilege to maybe give up some of the power to empower others, that's really key. It's one thing saying, oh yes, I know I've got privilege and I know I can do these things, but it's what you do with it and how you give that to others.
Debbie, can I just bring you into the next point that's on the screen? This can be a really difficult conversation to, as we've heard, people often say this is a difficult conversation to have, and I know people can feel uncomfortable having this conversation, but it's a conversation we must have. How do we help colleagues that maybe aren't there yet, that actually haven't got to the point that we are today in having this discussion, reflect on their absence of experiences? And just wonder whether you've got any experience of having conversations with peers or colleagues around their leadership about how they can make sure that they understand their gaps in their lived experience. Is that something you've got experience of, Debbie?
It's something we're grappling with, I think, as an organisation at the moment, because I think we all need to invest much more and really think about how we develop this understanding in our leaders and our management teams. And that's at, I think, right different levels of the organisation, because I think there is a fear of getting things wrong. I think when we see a lot of situations in the organisation where things have gone wrong, it's a lot of the time it's come because somebody's either clumsy in the way they've approached something, they're frightened, so they ignore the situation and perhaps ignore the person, and therefore treat them differently because they're scared, that they're frightened of getting it wrong. So I think what we need to do is to think about how do we educate our leaders and managers, and how do we make that part of everybody's development. In the past, generally, when people are, have training around equality, it tends to be very much, this is the law, these are people's protected characteristics, all of this, which, served a purpose. But in terms of really understanding and being able to see how other people, what their lived experience is like, what it's like to walk in those people's shoes, etc., and to understand that everybody has bias. We're all born, we all grow up, we all have certain biases, but it's about understanding that and how people behave. I think that's something that we haven't invested in at all as an NHS, and we need to do more of. I mean, I think stories do help, but as you say, it's about making sure it's not just one person's story and a very narrow perspective. I think that does help, and using real live examples in your organisation does help. We've had a couple of people who've come to the board. So at the board now, as well as doing patient stories, we have a mixture of patient and staff stories, and we've had people who've come to the board with their story. And that has certainly helped at the board level people to sit up and to think differently. But it's how we get that across all our leadership. And some of the feedback we've had is it's not necessarily the senior leadership team, it's more at the sort of middle and first level managers and supervisors, where they feel that they encounter what we call the permafrost sometimes, of messages and things we're wanting to do not getting through, or things not happening at that local level. So I haven't got all the answers, I haven't got the answers at all, but I think it's an area that we need to really focus on if we're to change perception and really start to move forward on this agenda. It can't just be a few people at the top having a commitment to wanting to do it. It's got to come from all of those leaders at different levels.
Debbie, it's really interesting you're saying we don't have all the answers, and I think that's really important for me. Again, with events like this, and when you work in equality, often people come to you and go, tell us the solution or tell us an answer. Well, I'll sort of give you a solution. Have discussions like we're having today with our boards. Find spaces for us as leaders in your team, whether you're a sub-board team or you're an exec team, whether you're a middle management team in the staff room. Actually look at the conversation we're having today, the types of questions that are on the screen, and talk about it and actually be honest about it. It doesn't matter where you're starting from with these discussions, but the discussion itself helps us move forward in terms of where we need to go. There's a lot of comments in the chat window that I can see about e-learning and training around it being tick box and not having the impact that we want it to have. And I loved your optimism about that it had a purpose around the law and protected characteristics. I've spoken to many executive directors who've told me that their responsibility is to make sure that there's compliance in the organisation, but then ask them to quote back to me the general public sector equality duty or the duty to show due regard under the Equality Act. And most of those directors haven't been able to explain that to me in terms of what that actually means. So not a criticism or blaming them, but actually also a reflection that even that approach hasn't done what it said on the tin in terms of getting that information across to people. And I'm sure that's a reflection for many of us that are in the call. PowerPoint slides do not deliver change. E-learning does not deliver change. Conversations, relationships, experiences, those are the realities that deliver change. And when it comes to training programs and training, what's your training plan as an ED&I team? Have a learning plan. Can't we have learning interventions that involve conversations, involve mentoring, involve buddying up, involve spaces where we have discussions like this? It doesn't have to be a formal qualification. It doesn't have to be a formal course or a workshop with a slide deck. And I think that we're so comfortable doing that because that's easy. We might even have the slide decks there and we don't have time to do anything new, that we just keep going back to that same box. So it's really good that you brought that up. The second thing that I'm just going to pull out from what you said is around the sort of people feeling paralyzed to act and this idea that actually people are worried about doing things wrong. And that sort of manifests into why we often have rooms where there's no diversity in the meeting and no diversity in meetings that are there to work on inequalities and to work on equality, because leaders go, well, I don't want to be tokenistic. I don't want to invite somebody into this space that isn't here. But actually the reality is, if we're working in HR and OD, we should understand the methods that we can do that in a non-tokenistic way. It's not rocket science. We can go and speak to some ED&I leads and we'll give you some tools, but you can do cross-sectional meeting structures where the membership of the meeting itself already has people from different grades and bands, reflecting this understanding that diversity at the top doesn't reflect diversity in the front line, and you'll get a more diverse space. You can say, we're not going to get people there because of their job role or band, but because of their skills and what they bring as a person. Again, that is going to be more diverse in a space. Or we can understand that there's leadership talent that exists sub some of our leadership groups, sub some of those positions of power. They're not there from a lived experience point of view, but because they bring something as a talented leader. So if we look at the Northern Care Alliance and the BAME Leadership Council that we have, that was set up to identify BAME leaders that we know are talented, that haven't had some of those opportunities because of the inequalities our organisation has, to bring those people together to be a resource for our organisation, to say, you're not in here because you've not been able to get that position because of the structural inequalities that we need to change and do something about, but actually we need your talent. We need to listen to that talent and bring it in, rather than just getting people in to share lived experience stories, because there's talent out there that isn't being utilised in our system too. So moving us on to that last question around, so often actions of leaders described above take away time from delivering real change. So these sort of circular conversations we get into around not having data, around, well, everyone's the same, or just saying nice things rather than having actions. How do we stop that? Because those conversations actually stop us actually delivering the change, because they take up spaces in meetings, they take up spaces in virtual conversations. I just want to ask Pav, I know Pav, you've had a background influencing in Parliament and various different political in the council, and I know that that's notorious for circular conversations. So just wondered about your perspective on how we could maybe challenge that and stop that happening.
I mean, I have a couple of views on this. One is that, if we're trying to engineer equality and inclusion, behave like an engineer. And that is that you're going to make mistakes, and part of that is trial and testing. It's part of your research process. You've got to engage in that process. You've got to make a few mistakes. You've got to work out what works, what the client needs, what the server end user needs before you're going to get it right. So that is a natural part of the process. And if you start framing it in those terms, it gives you a level of self-compassion, which I think is really important. And certainly I'm an NHS person now, so work involved in local government, but I think there's a real responsibility on us to be compassionate in that process, because, as a non-white person, as someone who's gay, someone who's Muslim, someone who's got hidden disability, one thing that's really frustrating for me often is when I'm told that I have to be, I mean, I'm pretty accepting of people messing up, because, I just, I've lived with it so long that one more mess up, one more mistake for somebody really isn't going to make a huge difference to me now. Just on the wrong side of 40, it's not going to make a huge difference to me. So fine, make it. So that's what I'd say, a little self-compassion. It's okay to make mistakes. The other thing I'd say is, meet people where they're at, which is that, a lot of boards that I'm working with are, interested in data, interested in strategy, interested in policy. Make sure you actively take a equality lens to each of those stages. At each stage, whether it's collecting data, apply an equalities lens and multiple equalities, not just one strand. Look at it from different perspectives at each stage. What's the data telling us? What's our strategy telling us? Is it reflecting what our data is telling us? Does it respond to what our data is telling us, our potential problem areas? And then the policy, which is our aspiration, does that reflect any ambition to fix what it is that we're doing? So that's what I'd say in terms of transformation, is the conscious application of an equality lens at each stage of the process.
Hannah, you've got a really interesting role in terms of just exciting role that you've just started in terms of transformative change around race equality. And so some of these challenges are maybe challenges that you're going to face. And I just wondered, how do you feel you're going to face them? What are your thoughts around what we've heard so far, and maybe some of your approaches that you think you're going to use?
So I think I'm in different minds on this. So I do definitely feel the pressure of taking away these circular conversations. But actually, I think we need to invest the time in having the real human valuable conversations. And that's not necessarily going to mean that we get the action really quickly, just by taking away the circular conversations, because I think they need to be replaced with something meaningful. And certainly, I've not been in this role for a long time yet, but the way that I've been approaching it is, tackling hearts and minds. So we know the data is there. We have absolutely all the data that we need to start making changes. But getting people to engage with that on an emotional level and to take that as their own personal responsibility, because like you say, as these leads in these roles, we can't do all of this work by ourselves, certainly in these organizations where we've got 10,000 people to make change for. And I think what I really want to spend time on is enabling people to feel comfortable to have those conversations in an authentic way, and to feel comfortable to speak to other people who have had other experiences and faced other challenges, in a way that they feel they can do openly and honestly, because without having that connecting stage, I don't think we can take meaningful action. I think we will continue in this circular pattern. But I think once you've got people really connecting with it themselves on a personal level and doing that personal work, then things can start to change.
Debbie, hearing what Hannah and Pav said, have you got any reflections on how, as a leader, you can help move that agenda forward from those circular conversations to the action focus that we need to have?
Certainly the staff in our organisation are saying, actually, we're sick of being surveyed, we're sick of assessments, we want action, this is the time for action. And so I completely agree with what Hannah has said in terms of how you handle that. I think certainly my role in the organisation is to support that to happen, to make sure that my colleagues own this agenda and feel it is important and really understand why we need to change the way we Well, I suppose it's the way we do business, really, in everything we do. And I think they are getting that understanding. But as Hannah says, I think what you said is really important about having meaningful conversations. We're trying to build this into our values and behaviours work that we're doing as a new organisation. The staff have come up with the values and behaviours they want to see for the new trust. And we're trying to embed this into what we're doing rather than it being seen as something that's an add-on or an aside. So we're trying to make this a part of that work, and to be able for everybody to have conversations around what do the values and behaviours mean for them, and when does that work well? What does that look like when people get that right? What does it look like when they don't? Against the three behaviours, we've three values we've got and the behaviours that sit underneath. I think it's tying it in with that. So it's explicit, but it's not seen by some people as an add-on or tokenism. So I suppose it's about enabling that to happen and those conversations to take place with various groups in the organisation, and tying it in with work that you're doing more generally as well, to embed those values and what does that look like? What does it look like when people get right? What does it look like when they don't? And creating a culture where people can raise things safely. I know my Freedom to Speak Up Guardian is on the call today. She just texted me, who works for us. And it is that thing, about people being able to come forward and say when people have got it wrong and how that makes them feel. It's developing a culture where people are safe to do that.
Thanks, Debbie, and it's really nice to hear that flow of the conversation we just had, and that still that need though to have that place to look at the hearts, to have that space to explore, as long as that space feels like it's going somewhere. And moving us to that point is we've had a discussion which I think we need to replicate in all of our organisations, not just here today. People that are on the call, I want you to go back and take this slide, use it to have conversations in your spaces. But I think it's important that we move beyond this conversation as well. Is what are we going to see? What's the difference? Tell us in every single area where there are inequalities, and they're in every corner of our organisations. And we shouldn't shy away from that reality that every corner of our organisations have inequalities that have been built up over generations. In a way, we've inherited those organisations that we've maybe colluded with without knowing that we have throughout our careers. But right now, knowing that those inequalities exist, we need to go and say, what's going to be different in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time? And be honest, that inequalities are not going to disappear in 4 years' time in your new shiny 4-year ED&I strategy. And if you say you're going to have no inequalities in 4 years' time, I don't believe you. And your staff won't believe you, and the people that are impacted won't believe you. Be honest in saying, yes, there's going to be inequalities in 4 years' time, because we live in society that still has structural inequalities. The challenge is big. But you know what? We are going to make big change. We're setting ourselves an ambition for change, and this is how we're going to get there. So you need to have those specific outcomes, those specific targets, and I'm not ashamed to say targets, they have to be there, but they also must intersect across all of the protected characteristics, not just ones that there's a nice shiny framework from NHS England or from the LGA or any other source that you've been given. Actually, if I'm an LGBT member of staff in your organisation and I don't see any ambitions around change, not about that you're going to monitor more LGBT people and get more data on me, that isn't a change. Actually, that things are going to be tangibly better, or that for your Black staff, your Asian staff from other minority ethnic backgrounds, actually are sitting there and saying, yeah, you're saying nice words, you're saying that I care, I'm a leader that's passionate about this agenda, we're going to have some discussions, but what am I going to see that's different? How is that going to feel in my workplace? Am I going to see more people like me in different roles in the organisation? And an area that I don't hear talked about enough is our underserved faith communities as well. Many of our people from underserved faith communities face similar barriers to colleagues based on ethnicity, and from our LGBT communities based on being disabled. But we don't talk enough about those barriers too. So what are you going to do to make sure that underserved faith communities see themselves in leadership roles, don't receive the bullying that we know that a lot of people experience with rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia? Be intentional about those communities too, not just the ones that maybe look good on Twitter, or that you can send off a best practice case study to a national provider that's gathering case studies right now. Do it because it's the right thing to do, and do it because it will make your workplace and your services better. So with that call to action, I'm going to thank the speakers that we've just had a really fabulous conversation with, and I hope you'll go back and look at the chat box, because there's been some real positive reflections on the comments that you've all made, and actually these are the conversations that I hope you'll go and continue to have back out there. It's been really powerful. But moving us on to the next slide, and we just finished talking about the need for action. And this is something for you all to take away. So this isn't something that I want to spend too much time doing with you here and now, because we've only got 10 minutes, which is the plan. This is something for you to have and to take back into your organisation. Say, actually, I'm going to use this. I'm going to use it myself. I'm going to use it with my peers. I'm going to build it into our OD, our EG&I plan, around actually the need for staff and colleagues to reflect on self and reflect on where we are. So we talked already about this idea that you have blind spots, that actually on a car there'll be things that you don't know that you don't know, no matter how hard that you look. And actually one of the things that influences and fills in those gaps of our blind spots are our networks, the people that we have around us, the people that we interact with at work, the people that we have, that we pick up the phone to at the end of a shift, that we go and speak to. And so when it comes to inclusion, it's as important about thinking about who your networks are as it is to think about yourself. And actually networks are something that you should have a real focus and spend time thinking about. Who are my network? Who are the people in my life that are important to me? So what you can do, and you can do this now just as we're going through it, in terms of you just reflecting yourself, not sharing, need to share it, but if you want to in the chat window, that's cool too, is just, if you're going out there, ask these 3 questions to a group of leaders, a group of colleagues, your team, or just yourself. 3 people you trust the most at work, the people in a work environment that you would go to for some advice or some support. You've had a difficult day at work, you've got a decision to make, you might ring somebody on the phone. I know Sasina and Naheed have numerous phone calls off me throughout a day, a usual working day. Even though Sasina doesn't work in the same organisation as me, her family's probably sick of the phone calls that she gets. And likewise with other colleagues that we have, the people that we trust and rely on. So who are those 3 people that come to mind? Who are those 3 people that you would invite to a leaving meal if we were allowed to have them? Maybe a virtual leaving meal now in terms of the world that we're currently in, but not the same 3 people. So who are those 3 people? And I want to think about the 3 people that you might say hello to in a chat window if you saw them on a meeting like this, or if you passed them in a corridor, socially distanced, that you would say hello to when you were passing, but you wouldn't necessarily take time to invite them to an event like a leaving meal. Who are those 3 people? Because that gives you a really good cross-section of your network in the moment. And then I want you to look at those 3 people in each of those groups and think, how many of those people are from BME groups? How many of those people, you know their sexual orientation, you know that you've got friends or colleagues in those groups that are lesbian, gay or bisexual? Because some people sit there, well, I don't know someone's sexual orientation. Well, then you don't know that you have those perspectives in your network. How many of those people are trans? Because often people go, well, I've never met a trans person, or I say hi to somebody, but I don't really have any relationship with anyone who's trans. Well, then how do you understand where people are? How many of those people were Muslims? How many of those people were Sikh? How many of those people were Hindus, Buddhists? I could list a whole range of different religions, Jewish. How many of those people are disabled, have a disability? How many of those people are disabled colleagues, or people that actually have health issues that you don't experience? How many of those people share your gender, or actually are from a different gender? Do you pick up the phone to somebody who shares your gender, or actually do they have a different gender to you? Now, I've done this activity with people working in equality and diversity, and often one of the challenges are that people feel really uncomfortable. They think it's a test. They think actually there's like a hierarchy, that you've got a good network or a bad network, and someone's going to say, oh, that's bad, I'm better than you because I've got more diverse people here or more diverse people there. It's literally a tool for you to reflect on. If we accept that we have blind spots and we accept that our networks can bring difference into our lives, then as good leaders, we should know who our networks are. We should be intentionally thinking how we can diversify those spaces. Again, not as a destination, but as a continued reflection, a continued journey. Think at how can we actively look to bring more diversity into those spaces. And so a way we can do that is sometimes people say, well, all of the leaders around me look like me. So my leadership team are all white, or they're all the same gender. And so it's really difficult for me to speak to peers to actually get those perspectives that are different. You've got to think creatively. Who's your coach? Have you gone and got yourself a coach? Are you reciprocally mentoring? Have you got yourself involved in a reverse mentoring program? Have you actually gone out there and looked for voluntary opportunities in organisations that you can support outside of work? That can have an impact on actually diversifying your network and service. There's no one answer. I'm not going to be able to give you a crib sheet and so this is how you do diversity. And I don't want you going onto some website and going, if you're gay, I want to make friends with you. Or if you're this, I want to make friends with you. Again, you shouldn't have to feel like that. But it's about you intentionally looking for those opportunities to be in spaces, to build relationships with people that have different perspectives to you. And if you do that, you'll be a better leader. You'll benefit because your leadership decisions will be better. And actually that'll have a positive impact on your career and your life. Our organizations will benefit because actually the decisions we'll make will be better, which means our service users will benefit, our colleagues will benefit. And the people that are facing inequalities who've for years not been able to access networks because they don't look like or sound like or have the same experiences as people in those networks will benefit, because for the first time those doors will start to open and they'll be able to walk through. So if I can leave you with a call to action, is reflect on your network and then do something to start diversifying that network that you've got. We can all do it no matter what job we've got, whether you're Tara, an equality lead, whether you work in frontline services or you're a chief exec. It's something that you can take away and do. Thank you so much for your time. I hope the conversations have been really powerful and have really helped you to reflect today. And I know you're going to continue to have some real thought-provoking stuff with the amazing Sasina, who is truly one of my role models and one of the people that inspires me working in equality and diversity. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tara. That was just fantastic. I mean, there's some great stuff in the chat box, and I just think a really wonderful session. And I think the great thing about it is, Tara, you're talking about action and calling us to action, but also giving us some of those tools and how we might go about it. And I think, you know, I put in the chat box, but I think just demonstrating this with the goldfish bowl approach, and I think seeing you role model having those sorts of conversations and the questions you asked in a really respectful but challenging way, because I think that's, you know, it just felt very much that, you know, this is the way you can do this conversation. It didn't feel uncomfortable from my perspective. You know, it just felt like you were getting to the nub of these issues, and I think that's what we all need to do, isn't it? So and it's great that we've got some support as to how we do that, so thanks so much. So now to come to Sasina. Hi Sasina, you're just getting your slides up there. Sasina works at the CQC as the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Lead. Sasina was working in North West for some time. We've known each other again, as with other speakers, we've known each other a long time. So Sasina, I'm going to hand over to you and to take us through this next piece, which is about understanding bias and micro inequities. So if you're okay, away you go. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Yeah, perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm really kind of pleased to be kind of delivering this session today, and thank you for inviting me. And I think Tara, that was a really kind introduction. I think one thing I've realised in terms of my network is about how much I'm learning all the time from everyone, and I think it's really important to understand that although we a lot of our job is around diversity and inclusion, it doesn't mean that we know everything. And I think that's the kind of perspective I want people to start thinking about when I'm talking about bias. We're all learning together, and it's about not kind of everybody being an expert on everything. The reason why I kind of touched, I'm going to talk about bias today. So we talk about inclusive leadership. There's lots of kind of elements that make an inclusive leader. And I did a 3-month comment with the Leadership Academy a few years ago with Deborah and the team around inclusive leadership, and we did a lot of research around what does inclusive leadership mean, and actually what does it mean to be an inclusive leader. And there's lots of things coming out around being authentic, being yourself, having confidence to make mistakes. I think that's a really big one in terms of if you want to be a good inclusive leader, you have to understand that you'll make mistakes, and that's okay. I think where the problem sometimes is when people tell me, and I've done training around kind of unconscious bias, where people say, I don't have bias, but I'm willing to learn from you, I'm willing to listen to you, but actually this doesn't apply to me because I don't have bias. And I did some work recently with Cash from the North West employers. We do a lot of work around bias, and we do get a lot of people saying, you know, actually I don't do bias, I'm not biased, and it doesn't relate to me. But actually, when you go underneath it, we all have that bias. So I think this is just one element of being an inclusive leader. And I think recently people have assumed that unconscious bias training is the kind of silver bullet, and that will solve all problems that we have around inclusion in organisations, including representation, including discrimination, and it'll be that kind of silver bullet to make everything better. And it's not. I'll put that out there in terms of a caveat. Unconscious bias training will not solve problems around inclusion on their own, but actually it's part of a bigger piece of work that people need to start thinking about internally and reflecting on things in terms of how does this add value to the work that we're doing. So people that know me will know that I don't always kind of promote the unconscious bias, because it's sometimes a get out of jail free card, but alongside other interventions, it's something that organisations should be thinking about. So just to kind of set that context really. So I'm Sasina Nadeen. I've worked in kind of NHS organisations. I've worked for the council, so Tameside Council, Salford Council. So it's really great to see colleagues that I've worked with previously on the call as well. So today I just want to kind of talk about what bias is, but really want to bring that in your reflections and thoughts as well, in terms of what that is and how that plays out in the workplace. So I'm going to start off with a video for you to watch, and again I'm going to ask you kind of put your thumbs up when you can hear the video, and hopefully that will kind of initiate our first conversation. So let me know when you can hear.
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me. My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months to.
So most people would have seen that video. I think most people, every time I watch it, I find it hilarious. So what were the assumptions made from that video? People remember what was the kind of, what did we see on the social media and everywhere around? What was that telling? What was the video assuming? Anyone want to either put in the chat or just say it out?
Everybody assumed she was the nanny.
Yeah, everybody assumed she was the nanny because, and actually, if you're on Twitter, there was a massive kind of Twitter influx of assumptions being made. And actually, what people said was, "Oh, why didn't that happen? The nanny's going to get sacked, and why did she run in like that? And why wasn't she looking after the children?" Automatically assuming that was the nanny, and actually it was his wife. And the reason I wanted to kind of talk about that video is that when we talk about bias, it's something that we make, a decision that we make really, really quickly by just looking at a kind of a scene or a clip. And actually, I'll have to be honest, I thought that was the nanny. I watched the video and I thought, oh, that is the nanny. And that's how bias works. And that's why when we talk about bias, everyone can be biased. I've been working in equalities for over 20 years and I have biases. We all have them biases. But what made kind of people think in terms of that clip that she was a nanny was probably her ethnicity, probably his ethnicity. He's a white man, white kind of in a good kind of senior role, and she was of different ethnicity. But actually, some of my friends were saying, you know, actually, I didn't think that was the nanny, because if that was the nanny, there's no way she would drag them kids across the room like that. That has to be the mother. So people pick up different things from clips, and that's how biases work. So when we make judgments about people, which we all do, we all have biases. And the research tells us there's about 150 biases that we have, 150. So things like similarity bias, where we're biased to people that look like us, or it could be confirmation bias. We have a view about someone and we look for kind of behaviours that confirm our initial views around that. So there's lots, like I said, 150 types of bias. So often we live our life kind of unconsciously. So what the psychologists say is that we have kind of 15 million pieces of information coming into our brain at one given moment, but we can only process about 40 bits of information at one time. So if you think about it, 99.9% of our kind of information that we get is subconscious, and that's how we make sense of the world, and that's how we live our lives. So for example, if I was to get up from my table now and go to make a drink, I probably would do that subconsciously because it's familiar, and I'm doing that every day. And it's similar to when we used to drive to work or have a journey that we was familiar with. Often I've gone to outside my workplace and parked up, and I don't remember any bit of the journey because I've done it subconsciously. It's familiar to me. I'm doing it every day. So that's how the kind of unconscious bias works. So we are hardwired. Our brain are hardwired to make kind of quick cognitive shortcuts because that's how we make sense of the world. That's how we make decisions, and that's how we can process information. And if we meant that we had to learn new information every day, it would mean that every day would be a groundhog day. We'd have to learn the same thing to do the same thing. So we store a lot of that information in our brains. So people who are geeking like the science bit, that is the science a bit about. We store information and we use that information when we need it, and that's how kind of bias works. Often we don't need to attend to our biases because, like I said, we do things subconsciously and unconsciously that we need to kind of rely on. But sometimes we need to attend to our biases because it impacts on the decisions that we're making, and it impacts on the people that we're working with. So in terms of bias, there's kind of three areas that we look at in terms of bias. So the first bit is that explicit bias, and that one's a bit more easier to call out because it's out there. It might be a statement that somebody's made, and it kind of borders on something in terms of the discrimination that people see and the kind of over behaviours that people have. So that would be something that's really kind of easy to kind of put your finger on and say that's wrong, that's unacceptable. And then we see the implicit bias, where the unconscious bias is that actually sometimes it's about intention. So somebody might say without thinking or make an assumption about someone based again on their kind of stereotypes or things that they've learned and the mind's kept in there. And that's the kind of unconscious bias. Sometimes that's, again, depending on how it's said, often people say it wasn't, it depends on intention and how that was taken. And then we've got the institutional bias, and that is the bias that institution that sits in processes and policies and practices. And I think this is the one that's kind of harder sometimes to address because it is built into processes. So things like if you kind of advertising for a job, for example, and you say you need to have a specific experience, or you need to have 10 years experience in doing this. So some of the arbitrary stuff that we put in job applications, that could be institutional. Things like grades, something already mentioned, banding. I know I've experienced where I've gone for a senior role, and people have said to me the only reason I didn't get the job was because I was 2 bands down. And actually, where is that coming from? Where's that institutional bias coming from? And the recent example one of my colleagues had was she was doing an online pharmacy kind of prescription type thing online, and the actual the box didn't allow her to put doctor and female in the same box. It was like you can't be a female and a doctor. So these institutional biases are still there. And if you look at the things like the workforce race equality standard, disability equality standard, and the inequalities that we're seeing in the workplace across NHS and other organisations and local authority, a lot of it's to do with the institutional bias that's been deep-seated and kind of entrenched in systems and processes, which means that certain people don't succeed or have worse experiences in the workplace, and that impacts on actually communities as well. So we know the health inequalities that we see. We know in terms of COVID now, which is very, very current, around the impact that had on Black and minority ethnic people. Actually, some of this is looking at how we address institutional bias to help combat that. So are we still biased? Often people say, we've moved on a long way around this agenda. Are we still doing this kind of equality, diversity and inclusion? But this is like some research that was done recently, a few years ago, by Judge, and they looked at bias and did some kind of research about how what today's society thinks about kind of difference or and diversity. And what it found was that 67% of the British public still admit feeling uncomfortable talking to a disabled person. And for me, that's really stark and really shocking that people are still thinking like that. Gay and lesbian job seekers are 5% less likely to get an interview. Now, I think this is a lot higher, but this is what their research said. And 80% of employers admit to make decisions based on regional accents. And I've seen this so much, and I think, you know, again, where these biases come from. I attended an interview panel last year, and I was an independent person, and one of the comments that somebody made when there was somebody from West Yorkshire who did the interview, and said, when the person left, said, I don't know how well that accent will go down well with the board. And that was something that somebody said straight out. Where does that bias come from? You know, is it that, you know, how are these biases entrenched in people that they have to make decisions like that based on how somebody talks? And as someone who's born in West Yorkshire, I found that really, really offensive, and I think I've made that point really clear. And then in terms of male and female graduates, within 5 years of leaving university, female graduates earn 17% less. Again, you know, we know there's a gender pay gap that is there. We've done lots of work around supporting and trying to reduce that pay gap, but we know it's still there. So we know that bias is there. It impacts on everyday decisions and often has really big impacts on outcomes for people from different backgrounds. So I wanted to say this about conscious or unconscious. So, like I said before, there is a bit of kind of sometimes this perception that because it's unconscious, it's fine. We don't need to attend to that because it's something that we don't mean to do. So we just leave it in there. And often that's about making ourselves comfortable to say, well, I'm biased, but it's not my fault because it's unconscious, and therefore I don't need to do anything. But you could argue, and I do argue, that what part of this is conscious and what is unconscious. And I think as leaders, it's about you reflecting on that and thinking, actually, what's unconscious about this and what's conscious. You know, when you're thinking about women who are Black are 5 more times likely to die at childbirth than white women, why is that happening? Is that conscious decisions that health professionals are making, or is that unconscious? So these are really, really big impacts. So I just wanted to kind of bring up these 3 headlines that are kind of picked up. And the reason why I think I picked these 3 is in terms of current climate around Black Lives Matter and the global movement. I thought this was kind of really kind of a poignant point to put up, really. So the first one is a woman who's a graduate. And she, when she graduated, applied for put in lots of CVs for jobs like you do, and didn't get very far in terms of responses. And what she did was she changed her name, and we've seen that quite a lot. And there's been lots of research done around people changing their name and sending the same CV, not only in terms of ethnicity, but in male and female candidates. So the CV is the same, but just changing name. And what she realised when she did that, she got kind of 100% more kind of responses back in terms of positive, you know, people inviting her for interview or interested in her. So again, is that bias conscious or is it unconscious? Is it somebody reading a name that's not a kind of Eurocentric name? Is that a biased decision, or is it a conscious decision, or is it an unconscious decision? The second one there is most people would have seen this, Edward Enninful, and he's the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine. And he just quite recently, after the Black Lives Matter movement started, he went into his offices in London, as he would do every day, and he was mistaken for the kind of delivery driver and asked to use a different entrance. And they said, you know, delivery people can't use the reception area; you have to use the loading bay. So again, something he tweeted about, saying, you know, we've had the movement around Black Lives Matter, and the conversation started. When everybody gets back to their normal routines, is this stuff going to be forgotten about? And it's really important that we carry on them conversations. And the last one there, that was from a couple of years ago. So most of you know Dawn Butler. She's a Black MP, and she was in Westminster in a lift, and she was told cleaners are not allowed to use the lift. So again, someone made that assumption that because she's a black woman, she must be the cleaner, and therefore she's not allowed to use lift. So, and where do these biases come from? You know, when we as leaders, when you look around the room and the only people around you that are black are people cleaning up after you or people serving you coffee, and then you see these people in positions of power, you know, you use your biases because it's not familiar. We don't see black people and black and minority people often in powerful positions. So when we do see them, our brain doesn't kind of link that with that could be a editor-in-chief or that woman could be an MP, because actually our familiarity around that is that we don't see people in positions of power. So again, really shocking stuff happening every day. Really, these are the biases that we need to attend to and say, right, we need to do something different about this. I'm going to move on to another bit of the kind of bias. It links to bias, and again, another video that I'm going to show you. And then similarly, I'm going to kind of want to go back out to what people's thoughts are, and I've got a few people that are going to be I'm going to speaking to. But again, I can't see the chat, but if there's anything coming up, it would be good to hear views after this video. So I'm going to, if you just could do a thumbs up again if you can hear the video.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, well, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Yeah. I'm Sasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's get a sporty! Double, toil and trouble! Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip, cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Okay, so the kind of scene you saw there, and again, it's really funny how we kind of observe some of that and find it hilarious, but surprisingly for some people and unsurprising for some others, that's something that happens all the time for some people. And that kind of leads us on to the bit around microaggression. I think it's really important when we talk about bias, we talk about microaggressions as well. And I think I noticed in the agenda we called it micro inequities. And often, and that's another word for it. And I think sometimes people think about microaggression, they find that quite a strong term. But actually, it is. If you think about what microaggression is, it does become in terms of that aggression and really kind of strong. So when we talk about microaggressions, it's that brief statement or behaviour, and sometimes it is intentional and sometimes it's not, and it communicates a negative message for a non-dominant group. For some people, it happens every day. So this is kind of for people who from minority groups, it's something that happens every day, many times a day. So it's not once a day. It's often subtle and hard to shake off. So, when you've got somebody telling you really overt racist or homophobic or sexist remarks, it's really hard to challenge that and say that's not acceptable. But things with microaggressions they're really, really subtle, and it's often they give you that self-doubt. Did I hear that right? Or did they mean that? And you start doubting yourself. And again, like when you're from a minority group or underrepresented group, you can hopefully relate to some of this. And I've put there any examples. So it'd be good to, in the chat, for people to share their experiences around have they got any examples of what a microaggression is, or if they've observed a microaggression, that would be really good. So something like this is really, really important when you're looking at the equality, the kind of bias agenda, but also as leaders, it's really important to think about when you might have been doing this and when you might have observed this. So some of the common ones, we've already said, where are you from? And then when you say to people, I'm from wherever, and then that's for you where are you really from, or where you're from before that. And my daughter is at university and doing a placement at a hospital, and the first day she went in to do a placement, she was asked, where are you from? And then when she said she's from Manchester and studying in Liverpool, and somebody said, oh, where are you from before that? And she did say, do you mean before that was in my mother's womb, if that's what you mean? And I think she used a bit of humour to say, but actually it's something that people assume that when you're a different colour, you dress differently, you've got a different accent, that you can't be from this country, because in their stereotype and their bias is that doesn't fit in with that. And often when you don't fit that stereotype and you say to people, I'm from here, I'm from Bury, I'm from wherever, people keep probing until they get the answer that they want to, that they're satisfied with. And often people will become quite defensive and kind of angry that you're not giving the information that you need to be given. So again, this is these are a big part of a microaggressions. You speak really good English. I've had that many times. Like, where did you learn the English? It's really, really good. Why wouldn't I speak good English? Taking more questions from men than women. I've seen that quite a lot where, in meetings. And also, something that's really common is when a woman might say a particular idea or bring something to the table, and nobody really kind of picks up on it. And then when a man says it in a different way, everybody's like, oh, that's a fantastic idea. So that, again, these are some microaggressions. Mispronouncing names is a massive one. I always say to leaders that if you can't pronounce someone's name, you learn it. If that means that for the next 2 hours you spend it in a room learning that name, then so be it, because actually people assume that it's okay to mispronounce. I think I always say it's okay to make a kind of mispronounce it once or twice, because you're learning. After that, it becomes a choice, and it's, as leaders, it's a choice whether you want to learn that. You think it's worth putting that effort in. Not acknowledging some people's work or acknowledging some people's over others is really, really, again, in the work environment, really, really common. And then challenging expertise and knowledge. Often when you're from a minority group, and I'll give my own experience as a Muslim Asian woman, you do feel that your expertise is challenged quite a lot. And I've been doing equalities for over 20 years. I have a master's in equalities, and the recent experience was when I was challenged by a counsellor saying when I mentioned the public sector equality duty, said he doesn't believe that there is a public sector equality duty, and I'm wrong. And actually, I had to give him the definition and give him the link for it. But again, it's kind of challenge that expertise all the time, because I assume that you don't know what you're talking about. And then when we've got microaggressions, it's really important we think about micro invalidation, and psychologists in America coined this term around micro invalidation. Just trying to look for her name. And what she said was micro invalidation is the most damaging and insidious part of microaggressions. And what that means is that when I say to you, this has just happened to me, you invalidate that by saying, are you sure that's what's happened? Or you're thinking too much about it, they didn't really mean that. And actually that's a bigger microaggression than the initial comment. So it's really important that when we talk about microaggressions, think about that. How are you validating people's behaviour? How are you invalidating people's lived experiences? Because I always say, if that's person's perception and that's their lived experience, no one else is there to deny that or to say that's not what was meant. And certainly not people who have not experienced that, for them to say that's not what they meant, or are you sure that's what happened? Kind of really doubting, making you doubt yourself. So what I want to do now is kind of bring people in around these two areas, and as I normally do in my style, is I've given people about 5 kind of microaggressions on a daily basis. And I think that's why we're saying we coined the word micro, but actually has macro impact. It's compounded behaviours that people in certain different groups have to deal with on a daily basis. Can I invite Deborah to kind of any kind of reflections on what Rahana said, or anything around the microaggressions that you might have observed, Deborah, or anything kind of you want to kind of pick up on?
Thanks, Sasina. Yeah, I mean, I've seen that, you know, what Rahana's described. I've seen colleagues, and actually, interestingly, it's something, you know, I don't know how it must feel for you, because when I hear people mispronouncing people's names that I know they've already said how it's pronounced, I want to say, you know, that's not how it's said. And, you know, only yesterday, actually, I was speaking to somebody, and again, their name was Saj, and I said, actually, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Saj or Saj? Because again, you know, I wanted to ensure that, you know, I was being respectful about what that individual's name is, much as you're saying, Rahana, about, you know, the Rihanna thing, really. I suppose I was thinking about an example, which was a personal example of being, it was more related to gender, and being on a sort of senior level board, and the individual chairing the board was a man. And what I started to notice was that when the men on the board spoke, they were listened to, and when I myself might have put a view forward, and even before I might not have actually completed what I was saying, you might have had a sort of subtle, almost a hand up that shuts you down. And I started to notice that this was the same, you know, with other sort of female colleagues on the board. And again, when other men spoke, and actually might have been saying very, very similar things, it was welcomed, and actually the conversation would have flowed on. And I think in the first instance, you perhaps think, oh, well, perhaps, you know, I wasn't putting my point across well, and tend to take it to yourself. But then, you know, I did start to see it again and again. And I think, you know, the question is around what impact it has. And it is absolutely exhausting, I think, as somebody put in the chat box, because you start to look for other ways of being able to get your point across, or you start to think about how you're saying it, what you're saying, you know, and almost start to observe others and what are they saying. And so I think it, you know, it makes just being able to operate, you know, around a board and have your opinions heard, etc., really difficult. How do we respond? I mean, I think I did take it offline and spoke to the chair about the fact that, you know, and again, the interesting thing about what we were doing, we were talking quite a lot about inclusion. So in some ways, it did give us an opportunity to raise the fact that, you know, it did feel sometimes that there was a real, you know, well, a bias, and that we were seeing these sort of microaggressions. But interestingly, I don't think that individual could really understand that, and so it didn't really get that much better. That individual isn't there anymore, but as I say, it was very wearing, and it's how you know, how you support people to understand that that's the case, you know, because actually he just could not see that's how what his behaviour and his role modelling was doing in that environment, really.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Deborah. That's really kind of really kind of powerful in terms of what you observed there as a woman, and then understanding the intersectionality around that as well when you are, for example, disabled or from a Black and minority ethnic background. So that's really kind of powerful. And I think your point about trying to challenge that and trying to change mindset, we're going to talk about that later on, but some really good points around how you can address bias or microaggressions when it's happening, and I will kind of go on to that. So thank you for that. John, can I bring you in terms of some reflections around kind of the unconscious bias and how in the workplace you kind of maybe seen some of that bias play out, and whether you know, how would you know if you saw that, and what would you do?
Yeah, so I mean, I think possibly the short and easy answer to what does unconscious bias look like is probably me, isn't it? And rooms full and senior leadership teams full of people who look like me and sound like me. And actually, I've only been at Lancashire a very short time, been there about 5 months, and one of the first conversations I had with our senior management team was on the topic of Black Lives Matter, and what the council's immediate response to some of the issues that were being raised ought to be. And so the first thing I had to say to the team was, well, I'm not sure that we're necessarily in the best place to understand this, because when I look around the room, out of the 14 people that are here, there's only one person of colour. Now, I'd say our management team has a brilliant gender representation, but that's probably the only, and again, this is not about the individuals and their capabilities, just about the level of representation that is there. And so really that was the first challenging conversation with them, was to say, I'm not sure we can give a good, well thought through response to this if we don't start from the basis of recognising our privilege and our lack of understanding and blind spots. It's really interesting that Tara used that word, because that was exactly the phrase that I used with them, was to say, you know, this isn't about you being at fault. You're not bad people, but you know, and again, I'm making a lot of assumptions. You might have things in your life that really do help you to understand this. You know, you might be part of a really significant mixed race family. You know, you might have cultural influences and experiences that I just don't know and I don't see. You may not all be a room full of straight white people, but for where we are right now, you know, we need to make some conscious, intentional efforts to understand that and to try and challenge ourselves so that we can begin to have the right conversations and to show the right leadership around this. So I don't know if that helps, but that's where I've started this from.
Brilliant. I think, John, I'm really, that's poetry to my ears, because actually you've noticed, and I think a lot of things, what we talk to leaders about is notice. So notice who's in the room and who's not, and call that out, and it's fine to do that. So I think that is a really brave thing to do. And I think, you know, we had an example just yesterday when I saw something on Twitter around the health inequalities, and you know, people who are around the room were not representative of the people that they're serving. So when you're talking about health inequalities and saying, you know, we want to represent underserved communities and we want to, you know, address some of the inequalities that our communities are facing, but everybody in the room is the same colour or the same gender, it's your responsibility to call that. As inclusive leaders, it's your responsibility to notice that and call that out. So I think you've been really honest there, and I think it'd be interesting to know how people responded to that, Andrew, in terms of your colleagues. Did they kind of take that on board, or did they just kind of ignore it? Oh, are you there, John?
They really did, yeah. Yeah, I'm here. Is my connection breaking up?
It's a little bit.
If you can hear me, they did take it on board, and I went away with the. Yeah, I went away with the permission to organise something that helped them to understand and get to grips with some of this, and to do some conscious, intentional work with them. The other thing, and I think, you know, for me, it was a big help talking to Cash about this straight away, was that particular focus to say, and in starting this conversation, one of the first things we need to do is to make sure that the one person of colour in the room isn't the person that everybody immediately turns to and says, how does this feel for you then? Because you know, have you felt like that? Is that what happens to you? Is that what you experience? And you know, finding a way to have that conversation and really protect that person and allow them to contribute, you know, with what they feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, John. I'm going to bring you in terms of bias and areas where you've seen that kind of bias play out in the workplace, and you know, did you recognise that, and what did you do if you did recognise that example? But what really came through was about kind of your reflection, your learning about how that might play out in the workplace. And I think it's really important for leaders to reflect and notice these things. And then often, you know, we say we need black and minority ethnic people, we need lesbian, gay people, we need disabled people in the room. And actually what's really important is that when you have them diverse people in the room, you also have a culture and create them conditions for people to bring their, their opinions and let them kind of enrich the conversation rather than putting them down, because actually, again, you'll just get people going to that group think that everybody's going to start thinking the same. So I think it's really, really important that you have diversity, absolutely need that. We also need space for that diversity to thrive and people to bring them opinions to the table.
And we have some real honest conversations as well. If you're in a space where it feels easy and everyone's agreeing and everyone's getting on really well, it needs to be difficult. These kinds of conversations need to be really, really hard. And I think there's a lot of danger in surrounding yourself with that warm, fuzzy feeling of, that was a really great meeting, I'm really inspired and we're all on the same page. And actually, are we just reinforcing each other's blind spots?
Yeah, and Tara says something about kind of don't just rock the boat. Well, I'll let her say the thing. What she always says this saying about don't rock the boat. What was it, Tara? You're on mute.
So I always say that if you've not been thrown out the boat once or twice, you're not rocking the boat hard enough.
Yeah. I told a story a couple of days ago of how I got fired once, and you kind of for rocking the boat, potentially a little bit too hard, but it was for the right reasons, and how actually you don't tell stories about that kind of failure and what you learned from it. You just tell the shiny successes.
Yeah. You know what, I mean, I know I'm running out of time a little bit, but these are such powerful conversations. So I just want to thank, I wish I could talk to you all day actually, because this is what I love doing, finding out people's experiences. So thank you to people who kind of took part with that in that bit of a session. John, Rihanna, Claire and Deborah. Like I said, I could do this all day, but we have to move on, and people are just conscious of the time. So one thing we know is we all have biases. Sometimes we don't attend to our bias because it's like making kind of decisions, safe decisions. A lot of the times we have to attend to our bias because it means that people are not getting jobs, people are not being promoted, people are facing health inequalities, people are getting ill more, people are not accessing services. So it's really important that we understand what our biases are, we reflect on them, and we have to dismantle them. And then challenging them microaggression. So again, a couple of tools that I'm going to finish off with that you can take back and start thinking about. So this is one I look at in terms of dismantling bias, and this is from a psychologist called Daniel Kahneman, who's done a lot of work around how we kind of make decisions. And what he says is there's two types of thinking, and this is from his book. Let me just remind me what the book's called. If you've not got it, I'll put it in the actual in the chat box. So what he says is there's two types of thinking. The first bit is around system one thinking, and the second bit is system two thinking. So what he says is if you, most people 98% of the time are in system one thinking, and that's really quick thinking, instinctive, automatic. So when I say to ask a question, for example, 2 plus 2, what is 2 plus 2? Most people will know that's 4, and that will respond to that. Or if I say to someone, I mention somebody that's close to them, that will evoke certain emotions in their head because it's reactive, it's something that's really reactive. And that's where we are 98% of the time. Then he talks about the slower thinking, which is system 2 thinking, which is more, it takes a lot more effort, and we use it to make complex decisions. And he says that we do this about 2% of the time. And the main distinction between this is that this is a deliberate, it's effortful, it takes time. So if you think about leaders and working in organisations, we face with lots of pressures every day. We have to make decisions, really key decisions. And if 98% of the time we're making that instinctive decision, it means we're in that system 1 thinking. And what the evidence suggests is we need to be more in system 2 thinking if you want to make a step away from that bias. Because what that allows us to do is to really think about what are we basing this decision on? What conclusion are we coming to in this particular scenario, and is that based on fact, or is that based on stereotypes or biases that I might have? So it takes longer to do, but actually if you want to help dismantle some of them biases that you might have, we need to start looking at how we can be more into system 2 thinking. And I totally appreciate that when people are making really big decisions under pressure, need things to be happening yesterday, it's hard. But again, it's about how do we start getting leaders to think about being in that system 2 thinking, because it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort, but we know that that will help some of the decisions that we make that leads to bias. So again, in the recruitment process, how we're attracting people, who we're tapping on the shoulder for these stretch projects and secondments and promotions, think about being in that kind of system 2 thinking. One thing I always do in terms of the kind of checklist, which is, sorry, I've got one slide that I've not got on here, but think it's this one, yeah. Is looking at dismantling bias. Is a few these are the kind of 4 things that I always say to leaders when they're thinking about dismantling bias. Disrupt them internal conversations that you're having. So we all have them kind of internal conversations about certain things. You know, when we look at somebody, make that judgment really quickly. We're in that system 1 thinking. Disrupt that. Have a conversation with yourself and disrupt your conversation. And sometimes that means you have to unlearn some things. As leaders, you have to unlearn some things to relearn them again, because a lot of your biases are based on kind of systemic, institutional, long-term, historical biases that you might have. So to think about how you're going to disrupt that that kind of internal conversation. Widen your circle of trust. So Tara did an exercise around people that you trust. If then people that you trust and go-to people are people like you, how do you widen that? How do you get exposure to different voices at the table? And again, I think as leaders, often we're surrounded with people like us, and especially if you're at senior level, because we know there's lack of diversity. How do you disrupt that and say, actually, let's invite somebody who's not a senior leader, but has really good lived experience and can bring a lot to this conversation? Understand your own core system. You know, that should be kind of focusing on your own kind of values and what we want to kind of, how that we want that respect and to kind of come into the workplace, and thinking about how we want to be treating people. And then recognize and adjust your lens. It's really important that when you look at your own lens, what kind of lens are you looking through? And Deloitte have done a lot of work around inclusive leadership, and they talk about the 6 Ds. And one of the 6 Ds is kind of looking at cognitive kind of bias, but another one is about cultural intelligence. And what that says is about, do you view the world according to your own cultural lens or other people's cultural lens? And how can you kind of start looking at the world from other people's lens? And then adjust that in terms of, you know, who you're inviting to the table, who you're giving them opportunities to. So these are some really good kind of points around just kind of challenging your biases. Notice is a really big one, and I keep talking about noticing, but it's really important that it's not just the black person that notices there's nobody else in the room that looks like them. It's not just the women that should be noticing there's no other women in the room. It's everyone noticing who's in the room and who's not. You know, are you treating everyone with respect? Are you inviting everybody to speak equally? Who are you giving that information to and the heads up to? Who has that power in terms of information? Who's encouraged to step up? Who's encouraged to get involved? And are you encouraging different points of view and appreciating and recognising people's contribution? And I think it's really important as leaders that you understand how people feel. We all know that you feel more valued at work, you're better you have better productivity, you're more likely to stay in an organisation, you're more likely to thrive and bring innovation. So it's really important that as leaders, you notice these things and you kind of understand how your teams are feeling and how you can improve that. But in terms of microaggressions, so we've got the last kind of 5 minutes now. So I always say that when we're challenging microaggressions, and like I said, we call them microaggressions, but they have massive impact on people, because some people will face this every day, every moment of the day, whether they're going to shopping, whether they're in work, whether they're driving. There's lots of people who face microaggressions on a daily basis. And it's tiring, and Rahana kind of alluded to the impact that has on people around. And there's a term that was coined in America called weathering, where you're kind of on the receiving end of these aggressions and this discrimination, and the impacts on you, it weathers you. And the research tells us, you know, in the UK and in the US, that it impacts on your health in terms of your life expectancy and the conditions that you have. So this is really, really important stuff. So we talk about micro interventions, and I always say when I talk about challenging people, I'm not talking about confrontation. So I'm not saying, you know, people have to stand up on a table and say, oh my, this is wrong. It's about how we do that in a respectful way, to a point. I'll just put that caveat out there. Ask for clarification. So when somebody said to you, you know, made a comment around, you know, are you in the right room? That's one we hear quite a lot. Or, you know, where are you from? Or do you speak English? Ask for that clarification about why they've come to that conclusion. What do you mean by that? And often that is quite a big impact, because people will start thinking, reflecting straight away and say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. So ask for that clarification. What did you mean back when you said that? when you said that, this is how I felt. So again, share the impact of what that felt like. And I always say it's not about, people might not intend it, but it's always about the impact it's had. So if somebody says I didn't mean that, always be clear that I acknowledge you didn't mean that, but the impact of that is this, how it made me feel. I feel really kind of hurt, or I feel really offended. Really important that you kind of put that across there. Given an alternative point of view. So did you know that actually, refugees don't, not allowed to work, or women don't do this, or LGBT, so this is the kind of, it's educating people to say, this is not how it is. What you've said is based on stereotypes, but this is what the alternative point of view is. Share your own learning. I always say when I start doing training, is about I'm always learning and I make mistakes. Like I said, I've been doing equality for 20 years. I make mistakes. So say, well, I used to think that, or I've done that in the past, but this is what I've learned from that, and this is how you can learn from that. And then choosing your time off. And I think I think it was Deborah that mentioned the board meeting. Sometimes it's appropriate to challenge straight away because that immediate effect has a bigger impact. Often, sometimes it's thinking actually it's not appropriate. I'll wait till the meeting's finished and I'll take someone to the side and I'll challenge them and say that wasn't acceptable, that was wrong, that was hurtful, that was offensive. So again, choosing your time. What I will say, there's certain behaviours that you kind of try and localise, get local resolutions, or certain kind of remarks people have made, and you think actually I'll do that one-to-one, but there's some things that won't be, no matter how much you try, people will still be, kind of purposefully doing things, and then there's other processes for you to follow that. But in terms of that challenge, that the microaggressions at that immediate time, these are some of the top tips. And then remembering it's everyone's responsibility to challenge. It's not just the person. So Black people didn't create racism, LGBT people didn't create homophobia, women didn't create misogyny. It's all, and it's using the allyship that Tara mentioned earlier on. It's about how do we all say that. So when someone's talking over Claire in a meeting, and when a man notices that, or someone notices that, they call it out. We all need to call this out. It's not just for that person to be calling out, and that's when we'll see that change. When somebody says, actually, I've just noticed that person not being listened to, or I've just noticed that person not being talked over to. It's all our responsibility, and it's not easy. It's going to be uncomfortable, and I think some of this work is going to be uncomfortable, but it's really important that you understand that when you get to that uncomfortable stage, and that's when you know that something's changing and something's not. Hopefully it's going to have impact. So I'm just going to finish off with this slide, and I think I really like this in terms of what this kind of quote kind of contextualizes. So I'm just trying to. So great teams need windows in the world, but biases mean or mostly get mirrors. So as leaders, how are we kind of ensuring that we have them kind of windows, we have exposure to difference, we have new viewpoints, but actually internally we're reflecting all the time and we're learning, and often that means making mistakes, but learning from them mistakes. So I think that's me then. Hopefully I've stuck to time, Deborah, but happy to take any kind of questions or
that was fantastic. I mean, 2.5 hours nearly, and where's that time gone? It's just been fabulous, the conversation, the insights, the interaction.